Also joining me on the papers this November 13, 2017. My name is Gladys Ambojibang. We begin this morning with the Post newspaper that captions on the incident that occurred over the weekend in Moyoka in the southwest region of Cameroon. The paper tells us that there are fears that 2 people have died and thousands others have left the area to unknown destinations. According to the Post newspaper this morning, 2 or more people are feared dead following a surprise military crackdown in the villages of Bafia and Munyenge in Moyoka subdivision of the southwest region. That was on Sunday, November 12, that sent thousands clamping into cocoa farms. The crackdown comes after village gangs used the current social tension in the 2 English-speaking regions of Cameroon to ruin community life. The paper adds that eyewitnesses says at least 37 military vehicles loaded with security forces invaded the subdivision. The forces reportedly touched down on 2 villages in the late hours of Saturday, November 11, and thus in the early hours of Sunday, a house-to-house search was conducted across the village. If you want the details on that story, then you read page 3 of today's edition of the Post newspaper. And then again, we talk about FACLA this morning in the Post newspaper, which says the FACLA has sued Attorney General and State Council and the prison superintendent. According to the story, the FACO Lawyers Association and 12 other applicants have dragged the Southwest Attorney General, the State Council for Boya, and the superintendent of the Boya Central Prison to court on charges of illegal detention of 12 applicants following a court order granting bail to the accused. If you want the details on that story, then you read page 3 of today's edition of the Post newspaper. And the Post newspaper again keeps us in the southwest region of Cameroon and tells us about Suela's explosive missive to Biya abandoned in an empty hall. According to the story, a memo written by the Southwest Elite Association Suela and destined to President Paul Biya was abandoned in an empty hall after a coordination meeting that held on Saturday, November 11, in Kumba in the Meme division in southwest Cameroon. According to the paper this morning, the document read at the meeting advocates for freedom or to free admission of Anglophones into HTTC Kumba and a quota for those wishing to read medicine at the University of Boya. The paper tells us that just 4 delegates and the Suela scribe Joseph Moki Etukeni showed up at the Kumba City Council Hall for the meeting. If you want the details on that, then read page 2 of today's edition of the Post newspaper. And then again, the Post newspaper tells us about the Minister of Communication, Issa Chiruma Bakari, who says secessionists have declared war on Cameroon. He granted a conference over the weekend in the nation's capital, Yaoundé, and says that those secessionist group have declared the war, saying that to him this is a prerequisite and a non-negotiable imperative on which no transaction will be authorized when it comes to the sovereign duty incumbent upon any state for the safety and protection of persons and property and the preservation of Cameroon's integrity. If you want the details on that, then you read today's edition of the Post newspaper. Then the Post newspaper tells us about animosity and confusion that mars the Boya Paramount chieftaincy succession. It says confusion, diatribes, mud-singling and image smearing and animosity characterizes the first consultative talks as the search for a successor of the late paramount ruler of the Bakweris, Nakuve Chief Justice Samuel Mokali Fafa Endeli heightens. The consultative talks, which were initiated by the FACO Senior Divisional Officer Emmanuel Ngamba Leroux, brought together the Divisional Officer for Boya, Paul Wakam Kwam, the Mayor for Boya in the Southwest region, Patrick Ekema Sunge, Chief Family Heads, Kingmakers, Elders, and the entire Boya populace. The meeting was held at the legendary Palapala Field in Boya Town. That was on Friday, November 10, 2017. If you want to have details on the succession palaver, then you read today's edition of the Post newspaper. Then let's move over to the Eden newspaper, which is interested, is still in the Boya chieftaincy role and tells us about the war of origins and super rights. It tells us about two brothers, one throne, and two heir apparent. It tells us about the confusion as number one of family swirl while Boya chiefs go mute. Then we have Prince Esuke Endeli, who says his uncle raised him as his footstool. Then Prince Ngomba Endele, who says his father left a will, and so they have to follow the will of his father. If you want to have details still on the succession palaver, then you read today's edition of the Eden newspaper. And then the Eden newspaper tells us about FACO lawyers that sue Southwest Attorney General and others, just like the Post told us. He says the people of Cameroon, the Attorney General of the Southwest region, the State Council of the Boya Court of First Instance, and the Superintendent of the Boya Central Prison have filed lawsuits in Boya for violating the laws of Cameroon. The respondents are accused of backstabbing the law. The details are found on page 3 of the Eden newspaper. Then in another story, still in the Eden newspaper, we learned about 63 billion francs CFA that has been allocated to boost agro-pastoral sector in the country. It tells us that the European Union has signed the amount to grant with the Ministry of the Economy, Planning and Regional Development. The convention was signed on Thursday, November 9, 2017 in the nation's capital, Yaoundé, and it will finance the agro-pastoral sector and the creation of roads in major production basins over the next 3 years. Have the details in this edition of the Eden newspaper. And then before we go through the Eden newspaper, let's talk about church news. And the paper tells us that it was fanfare at the beach echoes at PCC 60th anniversary nationwide. According to the paper, the Christians of the Presbyterian Church Down Beach Congregation Limbe joined their counterparts in Cameroon to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon. That was on Sunday, November 12, 2017, under the theme "Be Reformed Transformers." The fanfare that reigned at PC Beach Limbe during the celebration echoed the mood in all congregations of the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon nationwide. You have the details in this edition of the Eden newspaper. Let's move over to the Voice newspaper this morning, which is interested in southern Cameroon and tells us about the country with two presidents. According to the paper, narrates a story of the person who actually came up with the name Ambazonia and tell us that it was first pronounced by the Fon Fongum Goji Zinka, who is one of the traditional rulers in Widekom subdivision in the northwest region of the country. He explained in a series of interviews over the years that the name he was baptizing the new country of southern Cameroon, which was derived from a geographical feature of the land Ambas Bay, that thus the name Ambazonia. The name became popular after Fon Foji Dinka was won the landmark case at the Bamenda High Court. That was in 1992. The court judgment gave him the mandate to restore the independence of the area, which was at the time and is still under siege by La Republique. And upon the passing of the judgment, Fonji Dinka's followers named him president of the area. This actually tells us the story of one country and two presidents. If you want the details on that, then you read today's edition of the Voice newspaper. Then the Voice again tells us about Chiruma, who weeps for a slain gendarme but ignores civilians who died in the course. You have that in this edition of the Voice newspaper. Then the Voice again tells us about gendarme terror and tells us about an arrested alive in Jakiri dumped dirt in Abamenda mortuary. You read that in this edition of the Voice newspaper. Then we move over to the Times Journal. The Times Journal captions on Parliament's opened on Tuesday, and Anglophone renew their calls on MPs to step down. You have that in this edition of the Times Journal, which equally tells us about greed and autocracy that mar hopes for a united front over the fight for a southern Cameroon, and tells us about SWEC president in waiting rubbishes and greedy FACO elites. You have that in today's edition of the Times Journal. Then in this edition, you equally read about the obnoxious curfew that leaves an expectant murder death in Bamenda in the northwest region of Cameroon, and how CPDM FACO 3 flies into faction. Then we have land tax to appear on electric bills henceforth, and alcohol consumption that causes 7 cancers. You have all that in this edition of the Times Journal. Then let's move over to the Sun newspaper this morning, which is very interested in the killing of a gendarme and government that declares war against terrorists in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. The paper tells us that security forces pounced on villages around Moyoka, including Munyenge and Ekata, leaving at least 2 civilians dead on Sunday, November 12, 2017. Page 2 of today's edition of the Sun newspaper has details on that story. Then we have the Boya Paramount chieftaincy saga that rips Endeli family apart. You have that in this edition of the Sun newspaper, which tells us about travesty of justice and how FACO lawyers drag Southwest Attorney General to court and others. You will find all that in today's edition of the Sun newspaper. Then the Sun newspaper again says Mancho BBC calls for peace and a unity amongst the Anglophones in the northwest and southwest region, and the PCC in Cameroon that celebrates its 60th anniversary, and how the moderator tells Christians to be transformers. You read all that in today's edition of the Post or the Sun newspaper, I beg your pardon. And then we'll move over to another paper, that is the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune, which is very interested still in the killings in the northwest and southwest regions. That is exactly the killings of gendarme officers, and tells us how the Minister of Communication, Issa Chiruma Bakari, has granted a conference to denounce the killing, and says the first suspects have been arrested. You have that in today's edition on pages 3 to 5 of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune. And then the paper tells us about the division where Serac extends its largesse. You have that in today's edition of Cameroon Tribune, which tells us how the Humanitarian Association of the First Lady over the weekend officially inaugurated the maternity ward of the medical center of the subdivision and renovated and equipped by Serac. Diverse gifts were also handed over to the orphanages, royal women, and young girls of the division. Pages 9, 10, and 11 of today's edition of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune has details on that story. Then Cameroon Tribune is interested in investment climate in Cameroon and says that there's visible improvement witnessed in Cameroon. The 2017 edition of the Cameroon Investment Forum that ended in Douala, that was over the weekend, enabled business operators and authorities to measure efforts at making the country more investment friendly. Cameroon is gradually attracting more investors, it says. You read a special edition of the Investment Forum on pages 6 and 7 of today's edition of the National Bilingual Daily Cameroon Tribune. And then we move over to the Guardian Post. The Guardian Post that tells us about that Honorable Weber that tells Jakiri protesters, I will quit Parliament if it's your wish. You have that in this edition. It's the SDF Member of Parliament for Jakiri Subdivision, Joseph Weber, that was on last Saturday in Kumbu in the Bui Division in Northwest Cameroon, told protesters who marched to his residence with peace plans that he is ready to quit Parliament if it is their wish. The over 100 protesters were reportedly angered by the death in detention of the town's renowned witch doctor, Dr. Christian. You have the details in this edition of the Guardian Post newspaper. Then again, still related to the Anglophone crisis, the paper tells us how Ambazonian leader condemns the killings of gendarmes in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. He says the self-proclaimed leader of the Federal Republic of Ambazonia, a country which is still non-existent, has in a statement condemned the now recurrent killing of gendarmes in the two English-speaking regions of the country. Sisiko Julius Ayoktabe, who has been passing for the leader of the interim government, said last week that his government was entirely against the killing. Details are found in this edition of the Guardian Post newspaper. And then again, we have government that imposes dusk to dawn curfew on the southwest region of Cameroon. The paper says the preamble of the communication said the measure has been taken considering some acts of terrorism perpetrated against the forces of law and order by barbaric terrorists hiding amongst the population. You have that in today's edition of the Guardian Post newspaper. That article from this edition of the Guardian Post brings us to the end of today's edition of the paper. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to our programs.